Today, we're thrilled to welcome a true innovator in education, Matt Miller. Matt began his teaching journey in high school Spanish classroom, where he quickly realized that traditional approaches weren't enough. And instead of settling for the status quo, he turned to creativity, technology, and storytelling to better connect with his students. What started as classroom experimentation soon grew into a movement. Now, more than a decade later, Matt is a nationally recognized educator, author, and speaker. Over 100,000 educators subscribe to his free newsletters for practical teaching tips and his teacher blog, Ditch That Textbook. It boasts of more than 600 posts on creative, tech-infused teaching strategies. He's also the author of 6 best-selling books on education, including the award-winning Ditch That Textbook, AI for Educators, and more. Matt has presented at hundreds of schools, districts, and conferences across the U.S. and internationally. Whether it's through dynamic keynotes, hands-on workshops, or breakout sessions, Matt consistently equips teachers with actionable strategies that can transform learning the very next day. And we're especially excited to share that Matt will be the keynote speaker for our upcoming SWWC AI in Education Virtual Symposium presented by AID on May 16th, 2025. We are so excited to have Matt with us today. So Matt, welcome to the Integrate This podcast.
Yeah, appreciate you guys having me on. Thanks.
Yeah. So Matt, I actually this just occurred to me here. I'm going to kind of deviate a little bit right from the outset here, but I think listening to David's intro there, I think what struck me most is not it obviously is the long list of accolades and accomplishments that you've had. But I love that he started off with, you're a classroom teacher. And I know, was it last spring?
Yeah.
You had the chance to go back into the classroom, kind of as a long-term sub at a high school that your kids attended. And I'm just wondering, what that experience was like. And, it was that kind of like transformative in your mind and how you integrate technology.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways it was. So yeah, Jeremy, I did go back in the classroom last semester or last spring, I should say, for a semester at my kids' school, same school that my wife teaches in, same school district where I had taught years before, teaching all levels of high school Spanish. And I wanted to get back. Well, for one reason, I had been out for 8 years doing, presentations at schools and writing and, stuff like that. And I wanted to get back but first of all, just because I loved it, because I miss teaching. I miss being with students, and I miss, the daily creative work of trying to come up with ways to engage them in learning and, just to be able to, creatively problem solve through all the stuff that's going on. And I miss the relationships with the kids and everything. But another reason was, it had been 8 years since I had taught full time. And, whenever you're teaching full time and you have a full slate of classes every single day, there are lots of challenges and lots of opportunities and lots of things to do that are different that you just don't realize if you're not in it. And so, I got back in and taught 6 class periods of Spanish 1, Spanish 2, and Spanish 3. Had my sophomore daughter in my Spanish 2 class also. Like, no pressure, right? No pressure, Dad. Don't screw this up, Dad. But no, it was great. It was a great reminder for me of, just like the day-to-day challenge of trying to keep learning going and trying to make it relevant and trying to find ways that it works. But also the role of technology and all of that too. I had integrated technology a lot before, but 8 years ago, cell phones weren't as big of a deal. Learning management systems weren't as robust. You didn't have nearly as many ed tech products. And then of course, all of the AI stuff that's come on over the last couple of years, we didn't have any of that stuff. And so it was just trying to figure out like what works and what's worth it. And whenever I'm, trying to teach a full load of Spanish classes, what technology helps me accomplish my goals and what of it isn't really accomplishing my goals and I don't feel like I really need it as much. And so, yeah, I got to try a whole bunch of stuff. I tried, getting creative teaching ideas through large language models like ChatGPT. I tried, some of the teacher tools that help you plan lessons and stuff. I generated lots of images using Microsoft Designer. and other AI image generators, just lots of images for my students to describe in Spanish. And I mean, there's a whole host of other things. I tried some school AI chatbots in my class to have it like engage with my students conversationally in Spanish. And I mean, there was just all sorts of other things that I could have tried too. But I also was teaching for a semester after having not taught for 8 years. So there was a lot of like trying to get my sea legs back, so to speak, like trying to remember what it's like to teach and, getting back into the practice of it and everything. So in some ways it kind of dragged on for a long time because, it's work and it's tedious sometimes, but it also kind of like went by in a flash. Like there was just not enough time to do all of the things that I wanted to do. And I think that just sort of reflects the reality of teaching, right? So, it was interesting to see all of that, but then also it has since given me kind of like a good lens to look through some of these AI issues that are coming up and like, how do we do best by our students and how do we prepare them? And it's kind of given me a new fresh perspective. So sorry, I hope I didn't go like on and on too long about that, but it was a really interesting experience.
So if you take kind of like your experience from the classroom and, like actually implementing some of the AI strategies that you talk about,
Yep.
So you're bringing in your experience of what it's like to be in the classroom, but like, and then you can also bring in with that your experience, with other things that you've created, the Ditch That textbook, and your speaking and presenting engagements that you have, to kind of pull all of those things together. So what do you think is kind of now, from those lenses, kind of the direction that we see with our teaching practices and how our students are going to use AI going forward?
Yeah, it's such a tricky, I'm really trying not to use the word unprecedented because we kind of overuse that during remote teaching and COVID and all of that stuff, right? Like everybody's kind of sick of that word, but it really is sort of a new frontier that we're having to deal with when it comes to AI. What's interesting about it too is that some of the same old issues that we still haven't resolved are sort of coming up and manifesting themselves in new ways with AI, but it's also presenting a whole lot of new challenges too. And I think it's really forcing a lot of us to go back to some of those foundational things of why are we here in the first place? Like, what are we trying to accomplish as teachers? What do our students need from us to go out and survive and thrive in the world? And to survive and thrive in the world in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, that is probably in some ways going to look very, very, very different than the way that it does now. And how do we prepare them for that world when we can't even like totally see it yet? Those are some of like the big picture things that I start to see. But then I also, through the writing and the speaking and the actual in classroom teaching and being a dad, to 3 kids that are in high school and college right now, having my wife as a public school teacher. And so like through all of those things, I also realized that even though we want to prepare students for the future, there are still lessons to teach today. There's still lesson planning to be done today and grading to be done today and interactions with students today. And it's like, it's this great big sort of balancing act that we've got to do. And some of the like bigger questions about education and about school that it's starting to bring up, like what should our relationship with content knowledge be? What should our relationship with skills be? How much should it be augmented by AI? And how much should we push back on AI to try to retain what's special about us as humans? There's this like huge balance that we're going to have to wrestle with. And it's easy for the education pundits and the talking heads and everything to talk about it in great big theoretical terms on keynote stages and on LinkedIn and all of that stuff. But then we also realize that in the classroom is where it actually happens. And in schools is where it actually happens. And so it's like, yeah, we've got these big picture ideas about all of this, but then how do we actually operationalize this on the school level, right? And so I don't know exactly where you were intending for me to go on that question, but like, that's kind of where I've started to go. It's just that from that experience as a teacher, all the way up to some of that like big picture thinking about what are we trying to do, it's it's creating a lot of this like tug of war, like this pulling against stuff that we've done for so long, but then also realizing that some of the realities of today and of the future just aren't matching up with it. And so it's going to create tension, right? There's going to be friction, and it's going to be tough, and everybody's going to have different views of where it should go, but not everybody can have what they want, right? So it's like, whose vision do we go with, and what values do we follow? And we're just going to have to wrestle with a lot of that great big stuff, right?
Yeah, and I think you know, to tie a couple things together, so my own experience, like I taught for 5 years, and then I've been in tech integration for the last 6 years here, and it's kind of interesting because, and I'd be curious what your perception of this is, and just like the different teachers that you've worked with, and both in your recent experience and then, you know, going back a decade, like what I kind of saw was that you know, you talked a lot about like, we have outdated practices, or, you know, like we have new ways to get students access to knowledge, you know, going back even a decade, where we had it for so long, textbooks and everything, right? And that was our primary source. And then the internet opens up, and then you have all these ed tech tools that just gradually start to increase. And then you have now, within the last couple of years, you have AI. So it's like a continued push and trying to make these things all work together.
Yeah.
So if you think about that timeline and teachers that have been in schools during that timeline,
Yeah.
and if they're expressing, you know, oh, we feel overwhelmed by this AI, we have concerns about it and all that type of stuff. How do you kind of help teachers to keep the right mind frame when they're moving through all those different phases within that span of time?
I encourage them to embrace those feelings. I think sometimes people just assume that, you know, folks like me, or even you guys in your role, like that they just assume that we're all going to say, use technology and use more of it, incorporate AI, and AI is the way, and it's not going anywhere, so you might as well get with it. And I've gotten to the point where I'm like, if our goal, we've got to figure out what our goal is, right? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And for me, when I was teaching high school Spanish, my goal is to help my students become proficient in Spanish. Now, in the future, will we be able to put on our smart glasses with our little, you know, speakers and microphones and be able to have a seamless conversation without having to learn a language? Maybe, but not today. And so today, I still have the task of helping my students to become proficient in this language. And I have a set amount of curriculum related to it. And, you know, there's part of it where I want to try to prepare my students for this future, but then it's also balancing with this reality of today, that we still have a job to do today. And I think that's where some of that overwhelm is that you were touching on, David. And so I think whenever we try to pile too much of that onto teachers' plates, that's when they start to get overwhelmed. And that's when the burnout starts to happen. And that's when, you know, like whenever our view of what our job is doesn't match up very nicely with what's being asked of us, that's when some of that friction starts to happen too. And so I would say, you know, to the folks that are saying they feel so overwhelmed, and I totally get it because I was feeling overwhelmed in the classroom too, is to keep the main thing, right? So if there are AI tools that come along, and if there are, you know, if there's ed tech, and if there's, you know, ways to, you know, get new ideas and incorporate internet-based stuff into your classroom and everything, like, let's still make sure that it stays within the focus of student learning. Now, along with that, to kind of try to balance out, I feel like we also have this moral imperative to prepare students for the future that they're really going to see. And so I think that does incorporate some level of like AI literacy, of like understanding how AI works and how it's incorporated into your day-to-day life and your work life, and how it should be used and shouldn't be used, and like some of those core understandings. So I think at the school district level, we've got to get super crystal clear about what the goal is for the classroom. What are we trying to accomplish in the classroom? And the answer can't be all of this. It can't be everything. So I think we've got to be a little bit more clear about that at the school district level. But to go back to your question about those teachers that say that they're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, I would say keep the main thing. And then the other thing is, and it's the same thing that tech integrators like all of us have been saying since the dawn of Google Docs and the internet, and that is start small and go slow. Right? That's probably part of the big reason why so many people feel overwhelmed, is because they feel like there's so much of this stuff that they have to try, and that, they don't want to fall behind, and they don't want to, or they feel pressure. And we got to keep the main thing, right? We have to make sure that these tech tools support the goals of what we're trying to do in class, instead of just trying to incorporate all of this stuff, right? We don't want to get the cart before the horse, as they say. So anyway, those are, I think, probably the two big things. And I hope that that's the kind of advice that will help people to not feel overwhelmed as much, is just to keep the main thing, and to start small and go slow.
Yeah, I like the start small part. I think that there's a tendency with the overwhelming amount of tools and features that are available. I think it can be both for a tech integrationist who does training, and those that are teachers out at schools. It's sifting through and finding something of actual value that still, as you said, contributes to the main thing, or what is the main goal. And if you're trying to pack in 10 different tools into a training, I don't know, it's almost like it does a disservice to that feeling overwhelmed, and things like that. So I like the start small and stay focused on what the goal is.
And can I add one more thing to that I think plays into this as well, is that if we're trying to keep the main thing, and if we're trying to start small and go slow and everything, part of the problem is that in the business world, the ed tech business world, that's not their goal. And we're at odds, right? So you start to see from some of these tech companies, and they're like, oh, we want you to become our ambassador. We want you to try this out. Oh, we've got 7 new features since the last time that we emailed you. Let us tell you all about them and the way that you can use them in the classroom. And if you're using them, then we want you to tell us about it. And then we'll tell people about it on social media. And it's like all of this stuff that keeps coming out of them is in pursuit of them gaining market share and of them improving on their business goals. And a lot of times the goals of the ed tech companies are at odds. Not all the time. I found a handful of them that seem to align a little bit better with the real classroom and real learning, but sometimes they're at odds with what we're trying to do in the classroom. And so there's that pressure from them, whether they realize they're doing it or not. I think a lot of them realize they're doing it, but there's that pressure to try more and do more. And even if it's not coming top down from your school district or from, the tech integration office, or from, like your principal or whatever, even if it's not, there's still that external pressure that's coming. Because most of the time, if you try one of their products, you get signed up for their email list, and then they're emailing you with all of the things that they want you to try and they want you to do and they want you to remember. And
there's almost a little shaming that comes into that. Here's the 7 new tools, and if you're not doing these things, then you're missing out on what all the other great teachers that are out there are doing, because they're cutting edge and you're just like being left behind.
Then who are you and what are you doing with your life?
Yeah.
Right. It's like there's that feeling. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So I'm going to take you back to something you said you were touching on before, with AI literacy, it becoming important, and from reading your book and stuff too, preparing students for the future and kind of having your future glasses, right?
Yes.
And then I listened to your podcast with Holly Clark, and in your recent episode, I like this statement here. So I'm quoting you directly here.
Mhm.
You mentioned growing in our understanding so that we can make better human judgments. And so would you care to like touch on what is the importance? I'd like to call it human intelligence. And,
Yes.
Ethan Mollick would be the human in the loop, right?
Uh-huh.
What's the importance of focusing on the human part before the artificial part?
Yeah. I mean, it goes, I was talking earlier about in the classroom, we're going to have to go back to some of these foundational questions about why are we here and what are we trying to accomplish? And this gets even more foundational than that, I think, is that idea of who are we as humans and what makes us special? And what are we willing to let AI do and what aren't we? And what are we willing to let AI control and what aren't we? And that might seem like sort of like big and philosophical and everything, but it comes down into real world consequences every single day. And if we don't realize that we're making those decisions, then we aren't actively making those decisions ourselves. It's just like sort of like passively happening, whether we realize it or not. I mean, think for instance back to when smartphones started coming around and social media started coming around, and like we were totally unprepared for that. We had no idea what kind of impact having a smartphone in our pocket every single waking up. And I'm no better because here's mine on my hip right now, connected to notifications on social media, just like everybody else. But we had no idea what kind of impact that was going to have on us. And here we are, more than a decade later, and we're starting to see the impact on it. And we still aren't learning our lesson. We're still terrible at it. And there's still, all of this anxiety and depression and addiction to our technology and cyberbullying and like all of the negative things that come with it. And yet we're still doing it all over again. And now we have a whole new class of technology it's not like it didn't exist before. It's not like AI didn't exist before, but it has really come into the forefront in these last few years, hasn't it? And so now that it's here and now that it's advancing at such a rapid pace, are we going to make the same stupid decisions and the same mistakes that we did before with this? And I'm afraid that the answer is yes. And so when you talk about AI literacy, I think that's sort of like, I think those are some of the sort of the building blocks that we use to hopefully get it right or to do better. And so to me, AI literacy is the information and the skills that are necessary to navigate AI responsibly and effectively so that we can, survive and thrive in this future AI world where there's going to be so much AI influence on everything so that we can make those smart decisions and we can decide, do I want AI to do this or not? What are the implications of if I let AI do this? What are the pros and cons of that? What am I willing to trade away? Because with everything, there's a transaction happening, isn't there? When it comes to human versus AI, when we let AI do something, we are gaining something, but we're also losing something. And so I think we've got to be more aware of all of that stuff. Gosh, I totally forgot what the original question was. I probably better stop there.
No, that's great because you focused on the human part of that. Like I think all the way through, which I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it is too. And well, like you had mentioned the building blocks of, so I kind of want to just give you a scenario here and
Sure.
For our next question. And so we know that, just looking regionally, we have a lot of schools that have their teachers have implemented AI in a variety of ways, or they have, at least the beginnings of an AI guidance plan, or they've worked it into their, acceptable use policy and all those type of things. And we have some that just don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
But if you were just looking, so let's say that you were the superintendent of a school, and your school had not come into contact with AI at all yet.
Yeah.
But you know all you know about AI, and you were to look at, okay, you have your teachers and you have your students, and so what would be the foundational AI concept that you would introduce to them to help them wrap their head around it, and maybe even a use case of it that regardless of grade level or subject, where would you start them out in what you think would be like the safest way and a good way to introduce it to them?
You got like 3 hours to talk about this because we might need it. No, I mean, well, I guess you said, where would we start? Right. And so I think for me, and I think, again, I think lots of folks are starting to get the cart before the horse, so to speak. I think before we get into the whole concept of what can it do for you and how can it help and everything, I think we've got to have that foundational AI literacy piece in place. I really do, so that we understand the outputs, so that we understand the implications behind it and everything. Like, so we've got to get into, like, what is AI and how does it come up with its responses and how does it become artificially intelligent and where is it getting this stuff? And if I ask it to create a lesson for me, which way is it going to lean? Or how can I keep an eye on like which way it's going to lean so that I know that it's leaning? It's that sort of like that bias piece and everything. Like, I think we've got to get some of that stuff in place. And then whenever teachers have an understanding of what some of those bigger implications are, then when we start to see what it can do and the use cases and everything, we're a little bit better equipped to do so ethically, responsibly, to benefit our students, to preserve our humanity and everything. So I think if I were the superintendent, I would love to start out by, making sure that somebody who is well equipped to do it could give my staff a general idea of what AI literacy is all about. Like what is it capable of? What does it do? And then we can start to get into some of those use cases. Yeah. So I think that's probably where I would start.
Okay. So in some conversations that I've had recently with teachers, and maybe this is getting a little bit past the basic foundational AI literacy, but teachers are very afraid that students are going to use AI as a place where they can just sit and get information.
Yep.
And not really have to engage with it, not have to analyze it, evaluate it, and just use it to cheat. But when I tried to present this to them as well, I said, well, there's also, some great ways that you can go through this process of analysis.
And then they said, yeah, but cheating.
Yeah. And then, but cheating, but it can also be that creative thought partner and that's going to challenge your ideas, play the devil's advocate, and actually get you to explore your own perceptions of the content that you're dealing with in much greater capacity and much more critically than you could do without it. Right. So like, how do we handle that type of conversation with those teachers that this is just a cheating tool?
I've had so many conversations about this, and it's
one more than.
Yeah. Well, no, and it's fine because it's something that we definitely have to talk about. And there's so many folks out there that haven't gotten, I don't know, that haven't kind of like built up their understanding of it and what it's capable of and where we could go with it. So I think one of the first things that we have to do here's my big picture to my answer. We're going to tear it all down and then we're going to build it back up. Okay. So let's start by tearing it all down. And let's just say AI can answer things for your students, and they can sit and they can ask it to do a lot of the work that we've asked them to do. And it can write essays. And the problem is that part of the problem, at least if we want to try to maintain the status quo, is that AI detectors are terrible at it, at identifying that they've done it. And even if you do use an AI detector, like, what is it really detecting? Is it detecting that AI has done the whole thing? What if they used it to help them reword a couple of paragraphs? What if they used it to write a sentence or to get an idea? It's like, it's not just a black and white, did you use AI or didn't use AI? There's a whole bunch of nuance in the middle, and we got to be able to identify all that. So now we've broken it all down, right? It's like you are helpless against whether students have used AI or not. You are helpless. Okay. We can't punish. We can't we can't punish it away is what I'm trying to say. Because once you start to try to punish on something that you don't have confidence that students have done, it just starts to ruin the whole thing. So we just break it all down. In fact, whenever I do AI keynotes, sometimes I'll talk about this stuff and I'll be like, so let's recap for a second. Students can use it. They have used it. They will use it. And we don't have an AI detector to detect that they've used it. So we're good, right? And they all chuckle. It's like a nervous chuckle, you know? I'm like, so I can just walk off to a standing ovation at this point and my job is done, right? No. And then that's where we start to build it all back up, right? And so we say, if we understand that this is the world that we live in right now, then let's pick up the pieces and start to rebuild this thing. How do we go about it? And so, a couple of the things that I think are important. For one, I think we need to start to model how it can be used effectively and responsibly, instead of trying to punish the cheating cheaters. Because we spend a lot of time trying to punish the cheating cheaters. There was one time I did a workshop at a school district in Michigan, I think. And the dean of students was in the back of the room, and I started talking about AI. And at one point he raised his hand and even stood up and he was like, let me tell you about all of the things we put into our policy to punish students for using AI irresponsibly. And I'm like, there's so many things I need to tell you right now to tear all of this down, but we have a workshop to do. And so, I think that's one of the things we need to start to do is, it's like, if we have lost control over our ability to punish the cheaters, then I think one of our only, maybe our only recourse is to try to model how it's used effectively and responsibly. Some people will call me a Pollyanna for looking through rose-colored glasses and for being too much of an optimist or whatever. But I like to think of it this way, that if we start to show them how it should be used and how it can be used and how it's great when it's used this way, we have a better chance. It's kind of like the tide in the harbor. What happens when the tide comes into the harbor? All ships rise, right? And so all we're trying to do at this point is we're trying to flood classrooms with these ways that it can be used effectively and responsibly, so that students aren't just getting practice with and information about how it can be used to avoid thinking. Instead, let's use them how it can amplify their thinking, how it can answer questions in the moment, how it can push their thinking, how it can give them creative ideas so they can run with it as a human. And once they start to see some of that, then I think that's our best course of action. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is trying to punish kids for using a technology that we can't detect, and that's going to get harder and harder and harder to detect. And this is why at the beginning, sorry, you got me on a soapbox here. I'm going on this, but that's why I said at the beginning that we're going to have some serious thoughts about what we're trying to do here in the first place. Because so much of traditional education has been about right answers and wrong answers on a multiple choice test. And go home and write an essay about this thing and turn it in class the next day. And, if students don't see relevance in that stuff, they're going to outsource their attention to something else so that they can put their attention on something else. They're not going to spend their time and effort on something that they think is totally irrelevant. So we're going to have to start rethinking a lot of this stuff. That's part of the reason that I wanted to go back in the classroom, is because I want to be part of the solution. I want to try to figure out, along with everybody else, how we do this in real classrooms and real schools. Stepping down off of the soapbox.
Yeah. But I think you touched on another important thing here too, that great teachers have always done, regardless of the technology involved, is model for their students, right? Yes. And, and I think that same thing is true with AI. If a great teacher can get in front of their students and show them how they use AI in a way to hey, kids, last year I did this lesson plan. It was like this, then this year I'm going to try this AI infused lesson to up my game here a little bit, and it gave me some great ideas. And then I analyzed it. I looked at it and I said, this part here I think is going to work. This part will work if I change these parts. And this part I'm just going to throw away because, it just doesn't fit my style, or it won't fit the needs of my learners. But so if you model for students, I think how you use it professionally, I model how I use it personally as well. Like I show people when I talk about AI, my ChatGPT history. And if it isn't related to education technology in some way, it's a recipe or a cooking technique or, the latest thing that I'm trying. So, and I think, that's just another great way to show how all that can be brought together. And it's not just a sit and get kind of a thing where you're looking for to offload your thinking like you discussed, but as a way to elevate your thinking.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. That idea of and this is something I've talked about this in presentations and keynote speeches too. So we're like on the same wavelength here, that one of the most powerful things we can do as teachers, I think, is to talk about how we've used it ourselves. It's just to be a user of the technology and talk about our own experience. And the great thing about that, you don't need a computer science degree, right? You don't need to be a coder. You don't need to work for an AI company. You don't need any of that. You don't need any sort of special training. You just need to be trained in your content area and be a responsible human and talk about what you like about it and what you don't like about it and how you would use it and how you wouldn't use it. And I think if teachers are just willing to do that, just every once in a while, just whenever it comes up in conversation. But of course, if they're going to do that, they need to have some of those fundamental understandings about how it works so that if it comes up in conversation in class, they can have an informed 2-minute discussion about why you should or shouldn't use it and here's why, based on the actual facts instead of what they learned from that video they watched on Facebook that may or may not be totally legit. So yeah, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of irony too with that. We go around and we're training teachers on how to use these professionally, but there's some irony there when it comes to the student use, and then we're all of a sudden like, oh no, you cannot, not allowed. And so that there's a little bit of a disconnect there with that.
It's so true. Like I've done workshops before, and like in the morning, we'll talk about the things you can do as teachers. And they're like, this is great. I got to do this. I can't believe it'll do all this stuff for us. And then the afternoon we'll be like, what about the students? They're like, oh no, I don't want them to do that.
Right.
But I think it's important to have those conversations too, because, there's nuance in all of that, I think, right? Like we want students to be prepared and everything, but we also know that some of the things that AI can do for them will do the tasks that help them to learn the skills. And so if they don't do those tasks, if they don't wrestle with those things, they don't develop the human skills. They don't develop as humans. So at first, I was kind of the thought that, if it's good for the teachers, it's good for the students. But then I also realized that, the teachers are adults that have developed certain skills and abilities to think because they've done the work. They've wrestled with the content. They've thought about it. They've done those tasks. And so I think there's got to be some nuance, and it's tough. This is why it's so hard for us as educators, is because we want them to be AI literate and we want them to understand what it can do. But we also know that sometimes we have to do some very rudimentary human thinking and work that doesn't have anything to do with AI, so we can develop ourselves as humans. And so it's tricky. But there is definitely a duality there, isn't there, between the teachers are like, oh, this is great, but not for the students. This is great for me, but it's not great for them.
Right. Yeah. So much of this too lends itself to districts making decisions around AI. And I know this is kind of going around everywhere, through just looking at our state and some of the groups that are doing some great things with AI guidance. Even particularly at the state level, here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Department of Education, obviously, and they've put together guiding principles on AI. We have started to, with our region, try to take those and offer districts that have no idea where to start some sort of template to work off of and to get started in that process. one of the things, and Jeremy and I were talking about this before the interview began, and I think one of the essential parts is that the district has to have internal people that are making the decisions around AI. Especially from our vantage point, because we are kind of we're an outside entity. We assist school districts, but they're ultimately the decision makers, with a lot of this stuff. So I'd be curious what your perspective is when you look at, a district and how they should start having conversations around AI guidance. What do you think their key priorities should be when trying to develop some of that? And you could take that wherever you want, because there's so many things that obviously go into that with teachers and students and admin and all that. But floor is open. So however you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, here we go again. You got another 3 hours? Like we could, right? Like you're exactly right. We could talk about this for a long time. I think let me do a little bit of big picture, and then let me do a little bit of very practical and focused. So the big picture, one of the big things, and one of you alluded to this earlier, I can't remember who it was, but I think we've really got to look at school and our classrooms and everything through our tomorrow glasses. This is my analogy that I used in my book, AI for Educators. And so, tomorrow glasses is this idea that, a lot of times we're looking at our lesson plans and our activities and our school policies and everything that we're doing in class through the lens of today. Like, how do we prepare students for the way the world is today, the needs of the workforce today, like what's going on today, today's technology, right? And of course, the problem with that is that their future isn't based on today. It's based on tomorrow, right? It's based on the tomorrow of 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And if we prepare them for today, especially with as fast as the way that we see the future is changing, as fast as it's changing, we can't look at school through our today glasses anymore. We've got to look at it through our tomorrow glasses. Now, there have been some schools and school districts that have done a good job at this, but I don't feel like enough of them have. And so that's that idea of looking at it through the lens of, let's look at trends. Let's look at the way that the technology is developing. Let's look at the way that innovative companies are already starting to use things like AI today, and let's start to extrapolate that forward. Let's start to look forward at how might this change things in 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the workforce, and what can we do right now to prepare students for that future? That's the idea of looking through at learning and at school through our tomorrow glasses. And I think if we do that, we start to change what our priorities are a little bit. The other trick with that too, I think, is that, when we start to extrapolate this stuff out and look at what the world looks like 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if we're looking all the way out here, looking through your tomorrow glasses is fuzzy and out of focus, and you're bound to make mistakes, right? So you've got to get into that mindset. I think that we are going to try to prepare them for this future. We're going to try to predict it as best as we can, and we're going to try to be proactive and try to look at everything that we can, from our instructional materials to our curriculum to the way that we train our teachers to our mission statement and our guiding principles and our portrait of a graduate and all of that stuff. We're going to try to look at all of that stuff through what we believe it's going to be like. We're going to make our best case. And because if we do this, we've got a better chance of preparing students for that future than if we try to prepare them for today. So like I said, that's the great big picture idea of, what do we do? How do we prepare? If I was a superintendent, I think that would be, I would have, a set of tomorrow glasses, whatever that looks like. I bought something off of Amazon. They're like this little LED lit up. It almost looks like, from Star Trek, there was like that band that guy had around his eyes and everything. It looks a little bit like that. And I'd have that plastered on my wall in front of my desk, just as my constant reminder every day that we're not preparing kids for today, we're preparing them for tomorrow. Now, real quick, I'll bring it down into the much more practical, like what do we do? How do we do that? let's start to look at AI literacy resources. There's a ton of really good stuff all over the place, and there's more coming out every day. So it's like, what are little ways that we can do that? We're going to model how to talk about AI in the course, in the context of our curriculum, of our lessons. So like if you're teaching English class, let's talk about, well, if you used AI to do this, how would it be responsible and how wouldn't it be responsible? If you're teaching government, it's like, here's an issue related to government where AI is going to be a part of the decision making. And do we want AI as a part of this? Like one example I always go back to is like, AI powered unmanned drones, like military drones. If AI can decide to go in and neutralize a target without any human decision, are we okay with that? That's an ethical decision that we have to make related to AI. And so it's like, the more that you pull that into the classroom and the day-to-day, I think it helps to start build that capacity of knowing how to talk about it and how to think about it. I think we've also got to look at, from a organizational perspective, we got to look at the tools that we're going to use and the tools that we aren't going to use. And it's just like ed tech before, only lots of new stuff. And we have to decide what is in line with our mission and with what our teachers are trying to do and with what we're trying to equip our students with. And so I think it comes down to those decision making, and doing pilot programs to make sure that teachers are actually going to use them. I don't know.
And
There's a whole bunch of, yeah.
Sorry, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about is like within a classroom, a lot of it, so much of the AI decisions are with students happening at the micro level. Like you're making all these micro decisions that eventually your hope is, then going back to your big picture, you're hoping that as they get out of school and they're using these things, they already have a framework which to work off of on proper use and like the ethical decisions part that you mentioned too.
Yes.
So,
yeah. And you identified it right there. I think one of the best ways to teach that is not by coming up with a 2-week canned curriculum that you hand to the technology teacher about artificial intelligence, because then it's done in a silo and you don't see the connection and the correlation, anything else. Like, yeah, let's talk about machine learning. Let's talk about neural networks. Let's talk about blah, 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 blah. And then the kids are like, okay, done. Let's put that on the shelf and move on to everything else. No. I'm a big proponent of embedded AI literacy, where we embed it in the classes, where we prepare where we prepare teachers to lead those little micro conversations, just like you were mentioning, those little micro conversations in the context of what we're learning. And when we start to do that, we start to see how it's actually applied to our day-to-day lives. And I think that's way, way more valuable.
Awesome. So Matt, going to bring a little bit of closer to the end here. As David mentioned at the beginning here, you're going to be delivering the keynote for the AI in Education Virtual Symposium, which is going to be hosted by Southwest West Central Service Cooperative, which is David's organization, as well as their aid group. What kind of messages do you hope attendees are going to take away from that keynote presentation of yours, and what might they look forward to?
Yeah, I think this conversation is kind of like a preview to what some of it may be, where we'll talk a little bit about, what AI is and what its implications are in education, some practical use cases of how it should work, and then also some things that you got to be careful of, that we got to be cautious of, and what we can do to help prepare those students going forward. Like that's kind of like been my bread and butter when it comes to a lot of these AI conversations. And so I think, if you're going to be there for that virtual keynote, then I think those are the kinds of things that you're probably prepared to hear about, but also to discuss too, to have a part in the conversation as well.
That's great. So now we know that that's on your calendar here in the relatively near future. But like I'm a big fan of Hot Ones, and I love how Sean Evans at the end of Hot Ones goes, the cameras are yours. You got, what sort of things would you like to plug? Do you want to share contact information, any social media things? And we'd be glad to share them in the description of the show notes.
Well, there's definitely 3 things. We'll limit it to 3 things. How about that? There's 3 things that I would love to direct folks to. One of them is my email newsletter. It comes out 2 times a week, full of lots of practical teaching ideas. A lot of times I talk about AI, some of the AI tools that are out there, some things that you need to be aware of. And so at that link right down there, ditch.link/join, that'll get you subscribed to the newsletter. And you also get some freebies and some free teaching ideas just as soon as you join too. So that's one. The next one is for school leaders. And this is anybody that's helping to guide, like decision-making related to AI. I started this new newsletter called AI for Admins. And it's not just for admins, it's for, like teachers that are helping with the decision-making process and all of that too. But that's a weekly newsletter that just, goes over a wide variety of topics related to AI to try to help, give you some things to think about so that you can get it right. And then the last thing, and this is something that one of you guys alluded to earlier, was the Digital Learning Podcast that I co-host with Holly Clark. And Holly and I have been on a little bit of an unintentional hiatus. We're a little behind on the podcast, but we want to get it going again here pretty soon. But you can go to digitallearningpodcast.com to listen to that and to subscribe. If you're interested in discussion about blended learning, ed tech, getting that right, along with lots of discussion about AI. So I'd say those are a couple of places that you could definitely go.
Matt, thanks again. This has been an incredibly valuable conversation, and we appreciate your time and sharing your expertise on AI and education and what that looks like for teachers in schools. For those listening, don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to dive deeper into these topics, connect with other educators, and hear Matt's keynote at our AI in Education Virtual Symposium on May 16th, 2025. That is presented by SWWC and our aid group. The event is completely online, and it has a post-event on-demand access and includes breakout sessions covering practical tools and guidance for effective AI use in classrooms across school districts. Matt, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your keynote session.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.